Hi, my name is Emma Phillips. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of New Hampshire, and my advisor is Maria Bastera. Before I started at UNH, I was a mathematics instructor at Phillips Exeter Academy. I'm interested in both postdocs in algebraic topology or category theory and in positions at small liberal arts colleges. So I have three ongoing research projects. The first is my dissertation, which is in the homotopy theory of operads and localizations. And then I have other projects in principal two-group bundles and in applied category theory. So my dissertation research studies a localization construction for operads. This construction draws inspiration from Dwyer-Kan's hammock localization, which is also called a DK localization. So given a category C and a subcategory W, a simplicial localization is a simplicial category where we have an inclusion from C into the localization so that the images of all the maps in W's are isomorphisms in the localization, and the localization is suitably universal. You'll often hear the maps in W be referred to as the weak equivalences. So given two objects in C, X and Y, a hammock between X and Y is a commutative diagram, which looks really like a rope hammock, right? So we have all of these horizontal arrows are either going to be forward pointing or backwards pointing. If they point forward, that means that they're just any morphisms from C. If they point backwards, they have to be morphisms specifically from W, and all the downwards arrows are also from W. And we call this a reduced hammock if we put some extra restrictions on these hammocks. And the hammocks assemble into the hammock localization of C with respect to W, which is a simplicial category with the same objects as C, so that the K simplices from X to Y are these height K reduced hammocks. So hammock localization is a very well understood construction, and it has several nice properties. For example, a weak equivalence of categories induces a weak equivalence of hammock localizations. And under certain properties, the hammock localization is equivalent to the classical category of fractions. So Bastera, Babkova, Ponto, Tillman, and Yeagle constructed something similar for operads called a tree hammock localization. So here we create these tree hammocks, like you can see here. Again, these forward pointing trees are just any operads from any operations from an operad O. And all of these backward pointing arrows represent one area operations from a submonoid of the one area operations W. And all of these downward arrows are also going to be labeled by operations in W. So we can assemble these into the tree hammock localization, which is a simplicial operad where the K simplices of the N area operations are reduced tree hammocks of height K, and they have N labeled leaf nodes. So you may be wondering why we would even want to study the concept of a localization for operads. And it's because it helps us understand conformal field theories. So using Siegel's definition of conformal field theories, one might want to understand how the field theory modeled by the 1+1 dimensional cobordism category behaves stably. And this is essentially the same as studying when the operation defined by the torus in the surface operad is invertible. So ideally, this tree hammock localization should have the nice properties as the hammock localization. And trying to answer that question is really the starting point for my dissertation research. So in order to study that question, I've first proved that if we start with that there's a equivalence between the category of operads and a subcategory of symmetric modal categories. So I generally am thinking about operads in either sets or simplicial sets, but we can also do this in other appropriate categories. And we call this subcategory of symmetric modal categories SMO. So this theorem has kind of existed in the folklore for a while. There are some proofs of it, but those proofs have ignored the functoriality on the morphisms. So I've very carefully written out the details of the equivalence and also defined the subcategory SMO a little bit more strictly so that we really do get an equivalence. And we call the image of an operad O under this equivalence its symmetric envelope. So that means that now if I start with an operad O, and a submonoid of its one area operations W, I have two related constructions. So one thing that I could do is to first take the symmetric envelopes of O and W and then take the hammock localization, or I could take the tree hammock localization first and then look at the symmetric envelope. And those two things should be equivalent structures. So they'd both be simplicial categories if I start with operads and sets, and I want to show that they're DK equivalent. So the proof of this conjecture is ongoing, but pretty well through. So I have additional conjectures about this tree hammock localization. In particular, we want something similar to what we have with the hammock localization, which is that if I start with weakly equivalent operads, I want to get weakly equivalent tree hammock localizations. But in order to think about this, I need to have a concept of what weakly equivalent operads are. So that means that I have some sort of model category structure on operads in the category I'm considering. And once I start thinking about model category structure, the other question that I'm trying to show is that this equivalence between the subcategory of symmetric monoidal categories and operad is actually equivalent equivalence. So if we're thinking about operads and sets, SMO is a subcategory of permutive categories, which has a model category structure constructed by Sharma. And we can use the axiomatic homotopy theory for operads to construct a model category structure on operad. So another project that I'm working on is about principal two-group bundles. This is a collaboration with Daniel Berwick-Evans, Emily Cliff, Laura Murray, and Apurva Nakade that came out of one of the AMS mathematics research communities. We have a paper recently up on the archive as well. So we're studying two groups, which are categorifications of groups. So a two group is a monoidal groupoid with weak inverses. In our paper, we focus on two groups G that are categorical central extensions of a finite group G. And we take these central extensions are classified by a 3 cocycle alpha. And then we consider the bicategory of principal two group bundles over a manifold X. So our paper can be loosely summarized in the following theorem. So we start with sigma, a connected oriented surface. And a flat two group bundle on sigma is determined by a weak homomorphism from the fundamental group of sigma to the two group G. We also get a forgetful functor from the two group bundles to the G bundles. And these fibers are equivalent to bicategories of string structures on principal G groups. And when we take isomorphism classes along the fibers of pi, we get a U1 bundle that is the Freed-Quinn line bundle. So in order to complete most of this proof, we give an explicit algebraic description of the bicategory of both regular and flat two group bundles on a manifold X. And in particular, we show that when X has a contractible universal cover, there is an equivalence between flat two group bundles on X and the bicategories of functors of bicategories between point mod pi 1x and point mod G. So my third and final project is an applied category mentored by Simona Paoli, along with Elise McMahon, Claire Ott, Daniel Placido, and Maru Sarazola. So we study a simplicial model of bicategories, which allows us to view them as double categories called weakly globular double categories, which is a construction by Paoli and Franck. So bicategories show up very frequently in applied category theory. It's more natural to have weak composition and weak inverses in applications than it is to have these things be strict. But bicategories can be quite difficult to work with because checking all the coherence diagrams can just be a pain. So dealing with a simplicial model instead is a little bit easier to work with because all of those coherence diagrams are encoded in the simplicial structure. So we have two ongoing projects. One is that we're trying to develop a double categorical model of cospan, which is the bicategory with objects discrete categories and morphism cospans with the apexes any category. So this is a bicategory that shows up frequently in applied category theory, specifically with Petri nets. And the ultimate goal here is to extend this to higher dimensions. In particular, we want to answer the question, what would applications of the idea of a cospan of cospans look like? And our other project is to construct a double categorical model of Petri nets with tokens. So we're constructing this from scratch rather than pulling from a bicategory. And we're drawing inspiration from the double category of Marx-Paz, which is again a construction from Paoli and Franck. So thank you for listening to my research statement.